It's the kind of cold that makes stone feel alive. Outside, the wind combs through bare branches and pushes thin fog across the courtyard of Clairvaux Abbey. Inside, everything is quieter than it should be, quiet enough that a single footstep sounds like a confession. A monk crosses the cloister with a sealed letter pressed to his chest. The wax is still intact, the seal unbroken, as if the message inside is trying not to be read. He is led through narrow corridors, past candlelight that trembles in the draught, to a room where one man is awake when the rest of Europe sleeps. Bernard of Clairvaux looks up from his desk. He is not a king. He commands no army. He wears no gold. And yet, in this century, his voice can move mountains of men. The messenger kneels. The letter is offered with both hands, like a relic. Bernard takes it, turns it once, and breaks the seal. For a moment, the only sound is wax cracking under his thumb. Then Bernard reads the words that will change the direction of a continent. Edessa has fallen. In the candlelight, his expression barely shifts, just a tightening at the eyes, a pause too long to be ordinary. Bernard has lived among vows and silence long enough to know that the world doesn't end in one loud moment. It ends in a sentence delivered quietly from far away and carried by someone whose hands are shaking. Edessa is not Jerusalem, but it is a hinge in the door of the East. For nearly 50 years it has been one of the northern pillars of the Latin presence in the Holy Land, a buffer between the Crusader states and the rising powers of Syria and Mesopotamia. It was taken during the First Crusade and held against odds that once seemed miraculous. Now it is gone. Bernard closes his eyes, not in despair, but as if he is listening for something beneath the words. He knows what this means. A city has fallen, yes, but the larger danger is what falls with it. Confidence. The belief that the Christian foothold in the Levant is protected by destiny itself. When confidence collapses, fear rushes in to fill the space. And fear, Bernard understands, is how wars begin. Not long after, the abbey bell begins to toll. It doesn't ring like a celebration. It sounds like a warning, slow, heavy, and unavoidable. Monks stop in the corridors and turn their heads. Somewhere, a door opens. Somewhere, someone whispers a prayer. Outside those walls, the same sentence will soon travel across roads and rivers, from ports to palaces, from bishoprics to battlefields. Edessa has fallen. To understand why this matters so much, you have to look east, not to the churches and reliquaries, but to the realities of power. The man who took Edessa was Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, a leader with a reputation sharp enough to cut both ways. Some chroniclers describe him as ruthless and unpredictable, a man who could make promises and break them without blinking. Others, especially among the warrior elites of the region, saw him as something else, the first real chance in a generation to push the Franks back. Zengi was not merely raiding, he was building a state. He gathered Turkic forces from the Jazira, unified territory, and moved with purpose. And when the moment came, he struck Edessa at its weakest, when its garrison was thin and its leadership absent. The city's walls were strong, but strength on stone means little when strength in men is missing. There was no time for a grand relief. Appeals were sent, help was delayed or denied. In the politics of the Crusader states, alliances were never as simple as faith made them sound. And in the end, a breach opened. The defenders withdrew toward the citadel. The city was overwhelmed, and its people, mostly Armenian Christians, were caught in the storm of conquest and panic. Even the sources that try to remain restrained cannot hide the scale of suffering. Zengi, pragmatic as well as brutal, eventually ordered his troops to stop. He understood something the West often forgot. Conquest is easier than control. If he wanted Edessa to remain in his hands, he needed the cooperation, or at least the submission, of the local Christian population. He dealt differently with Armenians and Greeks than with the Franks, and he made gestures of protection when it served him. But no gesture could undo the fact that the Crusader frontier in the north had been cracked open. From the perspective of Jerusalem, this was not just a lost city, it was a strategic alarm bell. Antioch was now more exposed, supply routes were more vulnerable, and every Muslim ruler watching from Damascus to Aleppo learned the same lesson. The Frankish states could bleed. As if that weren't enough, the Latin East had its own instability. In the Kingdom of Jerusalem, King Fulk had died only a year earlier, in 1143, after a riding accident. His widow, Queen Melisande, ruled with their son Baldwin III still young. Melisande was capable, but everyone knew what a king's death could invite: ambition, rivalry, hesitation among allies, boldness among enemies. Even among the Crusader states themselves, unity was fragile. Feuds simmered between princes and counts. Pride, land disputes, and old grudges often mattered as much as shared faith. Zengi watched this carefully. He didn't need to defeat a single unified Christian army. He needed to pick apart a coalition that was already tearing at its own seams. By the time news of Edessa reached the west, the story had already grown in the telling. Messengers reported that the Holy Land itself was in peril. And in medieval Europe, peril in the Holy Land was never just geopolitics, it was theology, identity, and fear woven into one. So the appeals went out, urgent requests for help to the Latin kingdoms of Europe. In Rome, Pope Eugene III received the news and moved quickly. On the first day of December, 1145, he issued a papal bull with a title that carried the weight of memory: Quantum Predecessores, as our predecessors. It was not just an announcement, it was a carefully crafted summoning of the past. The Pope reminded Christendom of the First Crusade, of victory, of the creation of Christian states in the East, of the idea that God had once opened the road to Jerusalem. He framed Edessa's fall as a wound to the entire church, not a local setback. And he called on knights to do what their fathers had done: take up the cross and go. But a papal bull alone doesn't move an army. It moves paperwork, sermons, and debate. It spreads like ink across monasteries and bishoprics. The real question was whether it could ignite hearts. That is where Bernard comes in. Bernard of Clairvaux is not merely a preacher. In this age, he is the loudest moral authority in Latin Europe. His reputation is so strong that kings listen to him as if he were an oracle. And what makes Bernard dangerous, in the best and worst sense, is that he believes deeply in what he says. He had helped define a new ideal of knighthood: the warrior who fights not for vanity, but for duty, not for plunder, but for something higher. The military orders, like the Templars, were part of that vision: discipline, vows, purpose. Bernard saw the crusade as the ultimate expression of this ideal, a way to weld the restless violence of the noble class into something the church could bless. So, when the Pope called, Bernard did not hesitate. He began to frame the moment not as tragedy, but as an opportunity, a kind of sacred window in time. He spoke of a year of mercy, a year of remission, almost like a jubilee. He told men they were fortunate to live now, when God was offering them a path to salvation through action. He spoke of the Holy Land as Christ's own domain, using the language of feudal loyalty. If a lord's land is threatened, what kind of vassal stands aside? It was brilliant, and it was risky. Because the moment you tell a continent that God has opened the door, people will walk through it expecting miracles on the other side. Bernard understood, perhaps better than anyone, that he was lighting a fire he might not be able to control. But he also understood the alternative. If the West did nothing, the Latin East would weaken further, and the dream born in the First Crusade could begin to unravel. He also knew something practical. A new crusade could not be led by minor lords alone. To succeed, politically, militarily, symbolically, it needed crowns. It needed Louis VII of France. It needed Conrad III of Germany. 2 rulers, 2 realms, 2 immense sets of obligations. One young and intensely pious, the other seasoned, calculating, and bound to the shifting politics of empire.
If Bernard could bring them into the same cause, the movement would become something Europe had never truly seen before, a continental mobilization. And so Bernard prepares to leave his quiet abbey behind. In the monastery, he stands over the map of the East, inked coastlines, unfamiliar names, rivers that seem like veins on parchment. His finger rests on the word Edessa. He does not press hard, but the paper bends slightly under his thumb, as if the paper itself can feel the weight of what has happened. Outside, the bell has stopped. The night is still. Yet Bernard can already sense the movement beginning. Writers carrying letters, priests reading proclamations, knights counting coins, mothers sewing cross cloths, scribes copying the Pope's words by candlelight. A city has fallen in Syria, and Europe is about to wake up. Bernard steps towards the chapel, not to escape the world.
The road to the Second Crusade didn't begin with marching boots or clashing steel. It began with a young king sitting under vaulted stone, listening to men who all believed they were saving him. Louis VII of France was in his mid-20s, devout, serious, and strangely out of place in the glittering world of medieval courts. He wasn't the kind of ruler who hunted for sport just to be seen hunting, or dressed in luxury to prove he could. He fasted, he prayed, he carried the weight of sin like a crown you couldn't take off at night. When the news of Edessa spread across Europe, it didn't arrive as a neat report. It arrived as dread. A city held since the days of the First Crusade, gone. And with it, the uneasy comfort that the Latin East was protected by momentum and memory. In Paris, advisors urged caution. The kingdom was not a machine that ran by itself. If the king left, power could loosen in his hands, rivals would stir, borders would creak. A crusade was not a pilgrimage with banners. It was a gamble that could swallow a treasury and not return it. Even Abbot Suger of St. Denis, Louis's most trusted counselor, warned him against going. Suger was pious, but he was also practical. He understood the difference between holy ambition and political catastrophe. But Louis couldn't make the choice the way Suger wanted. For Louis, this wasn't simply strategy. It felt like a question aimed directly at his conscience. If the Holy Land was in danger and he did nothing, what kind of king would he be? What kind of Christian? Still, before he committed himself, Louis wanted one voice above all others. Not the voice of a general, not the voice of a diplomat. He wanted Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard's reputation had already become something close to myth. People said he spoke like a man who had already seen the end of the world and come back to warn the living. They said kings listened to him the way sailors listen to the wind, not because they wanted to, but because they knew ignoring it could sink them. When Bernard arrived, Louis didn't meet him like a monarch receiving a subject. He met him like a student meeting a master. And Bernard did not offer a gentle answer. He offered certainty. Not the certainty of logistics or victory, but the certainty of meaning. Bernard spoke of the crusade as if it were a door opened by God himself, an invitation so rare that only the blind would refuse it. He painted the moment as a season of mercy, a sacred chance to act while heaven's attention was turned toward the earth. To a modern mind, it sounds like rhetoric. To Louis, it sounded like a calling. And so the decision took shape, not in one dramatic shout, but in a slow tightening of resolve. The king would go east. The symbol that sealed this choice wasn't the treaty, and it wasn't a muster roll. It was a piece of cloth stitched into the form of a cross. The scene that followed would become one of the most famous public spectacles of the entire crusading era. In the spring of 1146, outside the town of Vézelay, a vast crowd gathered in an open field. Nobles in fine cloaks stood beside men in plain wool. Knights arrived with retainers and horses, while peasants pressed forward simply to hear the words. It wasn't just an assembly, it was a national moment, almost a continental one, because everyone understood what it could become. Louis stood before them as a king should, composed, dignified, surrounded by his leading men. But even from a distance, people sensed something unusual. He wasn't there to announce a tax or a marriage alliance.
He was there to take on the most dangerous vow a ruler could take, one that might cost him his life, his throne, or both. Then Bernard preached. We don't have a perfect transcript, but we don't need one. The effect is what matters. He spoke with the kind of force that makes a crowd forget the cold in their hands and the doubt in their stomachs. He didn't promise comfort, he promised purpose. He made the Holy Land sound not like a faraway place, but like Christ's own estate under threat, something no loyal vassal could abandon. And when Louis stepped forward and received the cross, the field changed. The gesture moved through the crowd like a wave. One by one, the great lords followed. Men who normally guarded their independence like a treasure suddenly bound themselves to a shared cause. The crusade stopped being an idea and became a chain of vows. There's a detail from that day that feels almost cinematic. Bernard ran out of cross cloths. The demand was too great, so he tore strips from his own habit and made more. Whether every part of that story is literal or embellished, it captures the truth of the moment. Enthusiasm was spilling beyond the planned script. For the first time in decades, Latin Europe wasn't just talking about the East, it was moving. And then came another turning point, one that would shape the human drama of the entire expedition. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine also took the vow. Eleanor was nothing like Louis. Where he was austere, she was brilliant. Where he was inward, she was worldly. She loved poetry, music, courtly display. She came from Aquitaine, a region with its own culture and pride, and she carried herself like someone who knew she was born to be watched. Their marriage itself was already a kind of political miracle. Eleanor was the heiress to Aquitaine, one of the richest territories in France, and her union with Louis expanded the royal domain in a way no battlefield victory could. In practical terms, she was power. In personal terms, they were mismatched. Louis adored her, but devotion isn't always the same as understanding. Eleanor could be charmed by piety, but she did not live inside it the way Louis did. And as the crusade began to form, her presence turned the expedition into something even more visible, more theatrical, and, inevitably, more fragile. Because now, this was not just a king going east, it was a royal court on the move. To the people watching, it looked magnificent. To a modern eye, it looks like an immediate logistical headache. Every extra noble, every attendant, every wagon and horse meant more food, more water, more coordination, more ways for an army to break before it even reached an enemy. But at Vézelay, nobody wanted to hear about supply lines. They wanted to hear about redemption. Even Louis, for all his sincerity, was also a man shaped by stories. The First Crusade had marched overland. The heroes of that earlier age had crossed Europe, crossed Byzantium, crossed Anatolia, and still reached Jerusalem. Louis wanted to follow their footsteps. And he had another reason too, one that most people don't consider until it's too late. A fleet could take him east. King Roger II of Sicily offered exactly that. Roger was powerful, ambitious, and eager to harness the Crusade's energy for his own agenda. He suggested transporting the French army by sea, and not just that, he hinted that the Crusaders could solve the problem of Byzantium along the way, conquering the empire that many Latin Christians mistrusted. The distrust was real. For years, Westerners had accused Byzantine emperors of double-dealing, of signing truces with Turkish rulers, of valuing their own survival over the Crusader cause. In the French court, there were voices eager to believe the worst. Some would have been gladly turned the crusade against Constantinople. But Louis refused. For all his limitations, Louis drew a clear moral line. He would not begin a holy expedition by attacking a Christian empire. And he also understood, perhaps instinctively, that if he put his army in Roger's ships, he might end up trapped inside Roger's ambitions. So, Louis chose the land route. At the time, it was a rational choice. It was the known path, the traditional path, the path of legend. But what Louis couldn't know, what no one at Vézelay could truly know, was that Anatolia was not the same landscape the first Crusaders had crossed 50 years earlier. Political borders had shifted, Turkish forces were stronger and more experienced at disrupting marching columns, And Byzantium, under Manuel, would not behave like a grateful host. He had his own enemies, his own treaties, his own fear of being swallowed by Western armies passing through his throat. But that future was invisible under the spring sky of Vézelay. All Louis could see was a field of men ready to vow, a saintly preacher calling him to lead, and the distant promise of Jerusalem like a star on the horizon. And so the decision became personal. Not just the mission to reclaim a city, but a test of who Louis was meant to be: king, pilgrim, or something in between. As the crowd began to disperse and the banners folded away, the real work began: gathering forces, finding money, arranging authority while the king was gone. Every decision would either strengthen the expedition or quietly sabotage it. In the weeks that followed, Louis would take up the symbols of crusading kingship: relics, blessings, sacred banners, wrapping politics and faith together until they were almost impossible to separate. And Bernard, watching the vows spread across the realm, would understand something he could not say out loud. He had just helped set the entire kingdom in motion. Now, the motion could not be stopped. The road to the east was opening, and it was about to demand its price. Conrad III was not the kind of man who liked being summoned by emotion. He ruled in a world where power was negotiated, not granted, where every promise was balanced against another promise, and every public gesture created a debt that would eventually come due. In the German lands, a king could not simply ride away on a spiritual impulse and assume the realm would remain obedient in his absence. Too many princes watched for weakness. Too many borders demanded attention. Too many alliances could collapse if left untended. And yet, when the news of Edessa spread across Europe, it didn't stay a distant tragedy. It became a challenge, a question whispered in courts and cathedrals: who would answer and who would stay silent? Conrad had already heard the arguments for a crusade before. He understood what it meant politically, and he understood what it meant to the church. But he also understood something many preachers didn't like to discuss. An expedition to the east was not a sermon, it was a machine. It needed money, discipline, supply, and an agreement with the powers whose lands you had to cross. Then Bernard of Clairvaux arrived. Even Conrad could not treat Bernard like an ordinary churchman. Bernard's name moved ahead of him like a banner. Wherever he went, crowds gathered. Princes leaned in closer. Bishops changed their tone. People spoke of him as if he carried a kind of moral gravity, something that pulled men toward decisions they would have avoided if left to their own instincts. At Speyer, during Christmas of 1146, Bernard preached directly to Conrad in the cathedral, with the kind of boldness only a man famous for holiness could afford. He did not flatter, he did not bargain. He painted a scene that was hard to escape. He asked Conrad to imagine the final judgment, to imagine standing before Christ while every gift of kingship was named aloud: wealth, strength, authority, influence, and then to imagine the question that would follow: what more should I have done for you? It was not a threat, it was an accusation disguised as a meditation. Conrad, the tall and battle-tested king of the Germans, felt the trap closing. Not a trap set by Bernard exactly, more like a trap set by reputation, expectation, and the fear of being remembered as the ruler who refused. And in that moment, Conrad did what surprised even his own men. He wept. He knelt. He took the cross. To modern ears, that might sound like a sudden conversion, but Conrad's decision wasn't born from pure sentiment. It was also calculation. A king who stayed home while the King of France marched east risked losing prestige in a Europe where crusading had become a measure of moral legitimacy. The crusade was turning into the defining public act of the age. If Conrad stood apart, it could look like cowardice or indifference, even if the real reason was prudence. So he committed himself, publicly, decisively, with the weight of the empire behind him. And then reality arrived, the way it always does after vows. Conrad began to gather an army,
Not a small expedition of knights seeking adventure, but a substantial host that would move like a slow storm across Europe. He had princes, bishops, lords, household knights, and the mounted elite. But he also had something that would haunt the entire campaign: a great many civilians. Pilgrims, families, servants, merchants, followers, people drawn to the promise of holy places and spiritual reward. They were not useless, but they were vulnerable. They needed food and protection. They added weight to every mile. One veteran, watching the crowds assemble, would later grumble that the Pope should have insisted such people stay home, because the weak and untrained became a burden to their comrades and an opportunity for enemies. It was an unkind sentiment, but in the harsh arithmetic of a contested march, it was often true. In the spring of 1147, Conrad departed from Regensburg and followed the Danube east. For weeks, the movement held together. The army crossed into Hungary, and the march remained relatively orderly. Markets appeared, supplies were bought, and discipline, at least at first, held. Then the host reached the Byzantine frontier. Here, the crusade entered the throat of another empire. In Constantinople, Emperor Manuel I Komnenos watched the approach with a tension he could barely hide. Manuel didn't see the crusade the way Bernard saw it. He saw it the way an emperor sees any great army approaching his borders, as a potential invasion, or at least a potential disaster. Manuel had his own war on his mind, against the Normans of Sicily, against political instability in the west, and against the need to maintain a delicate balance in Anatolia. He also had a peace agreement with the Seljuk Turks of the Sultanate of Rum, and the last thing he wanted was an enormous Western army provoking chaos in territory he struggled to control. So he negotiated. An agreement was reached. Conrad's army would behave in imperial lands, and Manuel would provide markets and guidance. In theory, it was a reasonable arrangement. In practice, it depended on mutual trust, something neither side had in excess. At first, the Germans moved through Byzantine territory without major incident, but as the march continued, discipline began to fray. Tired men grew impatient. Supplies became uneven. Minor clashes with locals escalated. In places like Philippopolis and Adrianople, violence broke out. Episodes that deepened Byzantine fear and confirmed Western suspicions that the Greeks were hostile. When Conrad finally reached Constantinople in early September of 1147, he found the city on alert. Walls manned, gates watched, soldiers visible in places where an emperor might normally hide them. Conrad and Manuel faced each other like two men trying to smile while holding knives behind their backs. And yet, there was one thread that kept the relationship from snapping. Manuel's wife, Bertha of Sulzbach, was related to Conrad. Blood in the medieval world could soften what politics sharpened. Negotiations were tense, but the two rulers managed to keep the peace. After about a month, Conrad's army was ferried across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor. Manuel provided ships, he provided guides, he provided enough help to move the Germans onward while quietly wishing they would move quickly and never return. Once in Anatolia, Conrad made a choice that would define his fate. Instead of waiting to coordinate fully with the French army that was still on the road, he pressed ahead. He wanted speed. He wanted to prove that the Germans could move with purpose. He wanted to reach Syria before winter closed in, and before any enemy could gather. He divided his forces. One contingent, under his half-brother Otto of Freising, took the coastal route. Conrad himself led the main body inland, aiming toward Dorylaeum and then Iconium. It was, on paper, the heroic route, the road walked by the First Crusade 50 years earlier. But the land had changed, and so had the enemy. The interior of Anatolia was harsh. Food sources were scarce, water could be unreliable. And Seljuk horse archers did not fight the way Western knights expected a battle to happen. They did not stand still, they did not offer a clean clash of lines. They circled, they harassed, they waited for the moment when the column stretched too thin, when the tired fell behind, when the baggage animals slowed the pace.
Then they struck, not to win a single decisive confrontation, but to drain an army until it could no longer function. Conrad's host was large, but it was not cohesive. The presence of so many non-combatants made movement slower and protection more complicated. The discipline necessary to maintain a tight marching order began to break under hunger and exhaustion. From the hills and ridges, Seljuk riders watched like shadows that never slept. And then, in late October, near Dorylaeum, the trap closed. The place itself carried a bitter irony. In the First Crusade, Dorylaeum was a site of a famous Christian victory. It lived in memory like proof that God favored the march eastward. Conrad likely felt that memory pressing at his back. Perhaps he believed he was walking into the same story. But history does not repeat itself on command. The Seljuk Sultan, Masud I, met the Germans with a well-executed ambush. A smaller forward force appeared and drew Conrad's heavy cavalry into pursuit. It was a classic lure. The enemy seems to flee, and the knightly instinct is to chase. Because Western cavalry, armored and confident, was built for the shock of contact and the thrill of decisive engagement. The Germans charged, and in doing so, they separated themselves from the infantry. That separation was fatal. As the cavalry pushed forward, a larger Seljuk force struck. The mounted Germans found themselves under constant arrow fire, unable to bring the enemy to close combat. Whenever the Germans tried to turn and engage, the Seljuks pulled away, scattering and reforming with practiced ease. Behind them, the infantry, now exposed, suffered badly. The column wavered, the line of command faltered. Retreat became necessary. And retreat under harassment by fast-moving skirmishers became a nightmare of its own. Conrad was wounded. The army lost men, equipment, and cohesion. What had been a confident march became a desperate retreat back towards Byzantine territory. Many survivors, once they reached Nicaea, abandoned.
Once the Second Crusade caught fire, it stopped behaving like a single campaign. It became something larger, something Bernard of Clairvaux may have inspired but could no longer fully steer. In Bernard's mind, the mission was clear. The Latin East had been wounded, Edessa had fallen, the Crusader states were exposed. The West had to respond with speed and strength. But the moment Europe began to move, other rulers and other frontiers stepped forward with their own urgent requests, their own dangers, their own ambitions. And Bernard, whose authority now carried continental weight, made a decision that changed crusading history. He said yes. The crusade would not be limited to Syria and Jerusalem. It would expand. And in doing so, it would become the first truly multi-front crusading effort of the Middle Ages, something that feels, in modern terms, almost like a medieval world war. From a distance, it looks like unity, a continent answering one call. Up close, it looks like something else. The same sacred banner stretched across competing goals, layered motives, and very different kinds of warfare. In the north and northeast, Saxon nobles approached Bernard with an argument that sounded perfectly crusading. They spoke of pagan Slavic peoples, the Wends, living east of the Elbe River. They described raids, hostage-taking, and a frontier that never truly slept. They asked a simple question. If knights were called to fight God's enemies in the Holy Land, why should they not fight them here, at their own borders? Bernard listened and he agreed. He wrote to Pope Eugenius III, urging that the Crusade's spiritual privileges be extended to the Baltic frontier. The Pope, who rarely refused Bernard, approved. Suddenly, the same indulgence offered to those marching to Jerusalem was offered to those riding into Wendish lands. But Bernard did more than approve a campaign. He tried to define its goal in absolute spiritual terms. He insisted that the purpose was conversion, and he pushed a rule that shocked even some of his contemporaries. Peace should not be made with the Wends for money or tribute, not until they accepted baptism. To modern ears, it's a chilling line because it suggests a logic that crusading would later return to again and again. War not merely to defeat, but to transform. And yet, even in Bernard's lifetime, frontier realities made such purity difficult. Border wars were often about tribute, land, trade routes, and control, things that did not neatly fit inside a sermon. Still, the precedent was set. The Northern Crusades had effectively been born, even if no one yet knew how long that story would last. At the same time, in the far southwest of Europe, the rulers of Iberia saw an opportunity. Spain and Portugal had been fighting for generations against Muslim states and empires, in a long struggle that later generations would call the Reconquista. For these kings, crusading wasn't a new idea, it was a familiar language of legitimacy. King Alfonso I of Portugal wanted help taking Lisbon, held by a Muslim Taifa. King Alfonso VII of León and Castile wanted help attacking Almería, a wealthy Mediterranean port linked to North African power. They petitioned the Pope. They wanted their campaigns recognized as part of the same crusading enterprise. And once again, the answer was yes. Pope Eugenius issued additional support and indulgences for those who would fight in Iberia. Now a crusader in 1147 could choose his destination, the Holy Land, the Baltic frontier, or the Iberian Peninsula. From a modern perspective, this is the moment the crusade becomes a flexible political instrument. One spiritual promise could be applied to multiple theaters. It wasn't simply about reclaiming one city. It became a way of sanctifying expansion, defense, and conquest across the edges of Latin Christendom. And the consequences were immediate. In Iberia, the crusade translated into rapid concrete successes because the warfare there was close to home, the logistics were simpler, and the local rulers already understood the terrain, the enemy, and the methods of siege and frontier campaigning. Afonso of Portugal moved quickly. In the spring of 1147, he captured Santarém in a surprise thrust that opened the way towards Lisbon. Soon after, a fleet of crusaders from northern Europe, men from places like England, Flanders, and the Rhineland, arrived on the Atlantic coast. They had originally intended to sail all the way to the Holy Land, but when they met Portuguese envoys, promises were made: a share of spoils, trading privileges, even land for those who wished to settle. In other words, faith was present, but so was opportunity. The combined forces laid siege to Lisbon in early summer of that year. The city was strong and the defense stubborn, but the Crusaders brought engineering, mining beneath walls, siege towers, blockade from the sea. Hunger tightened inside the city. Disease spread. Relief did not arrive in time. In October of that year, Lisbon surrendered. For Portugal, this was a transformational victory, one that pushed the frontier permanently southward and helped shape the future kingdom. And for the Northern Crusaders who had stopped there on their way east, it was proof that the crusading vow could pay dividends long before Jerusalem was even in sight. Meanwhile, on the Mediterranean side of Iberia, Alfonso VII coordinated with Genoa. This was crusading in its most practical form. The king needed ships and siege equipment, and Genoa wanted commercial privileges and a share of conquest. Agreements were drafted. Terms were negotiated like contracts. Almería fell in October of 1147 as well, almost at the same time as Lisbon. And soon, momentum carried forward into further campaigns like Torsosa. If Bernard had wanted examples of Christian victory under the banner of crusade, Iberia provided them in abundance. The Baltic, however, was a different story. There, the crusade would collide with geography, divided leadership, and the reality that frontier war did not always produce permanent conversion. Even when tribute was secured or fortresses pressured into temporary submission, the deeper religious transformation Bernard demanded proved far harder to achieve at sword point. So, the Second Crusade became a paradox: brilliant success in the west, ambiguity in the north, and uncertainty looming in the east, where the kings of France and Germany were still struggling to reach the Holy Land. And then, just as this multi-front crusade was accelerating, news arrived from Syria that seemed, at first, like a sign from heaven. Zengi was dead.
In September of 1146, the Atabeg who had taken Edessa was killed by one of his own slaves. Across the Latin East, people exhaled. It felt like a reversal of fortune, as if the enemy's strength had been cut at the root. But history rarely offers such clean gifts. Zengi's domains did not vanish, they fractured, reorganized, and in time would produce leaders even more dangerous to the Crusader states. His sons fought for inheritance. Nur el-Din secured Aleppo. Mosul became another power center. Conflict between them created openings, brief, tempting openings that the Franks tried to exploit. Count Jocelyn II even managed for a short time to re-enter Edessa after Zengi's death, but it did not last. When Nur el-Din arrived with force, he did what Zengi did not fully do. He made sure Edessa could not become a Frankish foothold again. By the time the West's great armies were forming, Edessa, the original cause of the Second Crusade, was no longer a viable prize. That's one of the strangest ironies of the entire enterprise. The crusade was called to recover a city that would soon be reduced to ruin, while the Crusaders were still on the road. In modern terms, the strategic objective moved faster than the coalition designed to achieve it. The problem changed while the solution was still being assembled. And this is where Bernard's decision to expand the crusade becomes even more complicated. On one hand, the expansion brought victories in Iberia and opened a new era in the north. It showed the power of a united Christendom, at least in appearance, mobilizing across borders. On the other hand, it raised an uncomfortable question. Was Latin Europe stretching itself too thin? Was the strongest energy of the age being divided among too many fronts, too many ambitions, too many local agendas? Bernard could not answer that question with numbers. He answered it with faith. He believed that the cause was holy and that holiness would multiply strength. But as the kings marched east and as Anatolia began to swallow armies in its mountains and valleys, the limits of that belief would become painfully visible. The Second Crusade was now in motion across three theaters, north, west, and east, each with its own logic, its own prizes, its own traps. It had become continental, and the fate of the enterprise would no longer depend on a single battle or even a single city. It would depend on whether a shared spiritual banner could hold together a world of competing realities.
Constantinople rises out of the horizon like a city that was never meant to be real. You, Louis of France, have marched for weeks through lands that still feel familiar. The roads of Hungary were hard but workable. Markets opened, supplies could be bought. The rhythm of movement, at least for a while, made the crusade feel possible. Then you cross into Byzantine territory and everything changes. It isn't just the language, it's the posture of the world around you. Gates close sooner. City walls feel less like protection and more like warning. Local officials measure your army with their eyes the way a man measures a storm cloud, trying to decide whether it will pass or break over his roof. In your camp, the mood shifts. The vows are still there, stitched into cloaks, carried like a second skin. But now the crusade has entered the throat of another empire, and empires don't breathe easily when foreign armies press against them. When Constantinople finally appears, it is overwhelming. The walls are layered like a fortress built by time itself. Towers rise like spears. Domes catch the light in a way that makes stone look weightless. Even your proud French nobles fall quiet, because the city doesn't merely look rich, it looks ancient, confident, and armed. This is not the East you imagined from stories of Jerusalem. This is the other Rome, the one that never fell, and it has been watching the West for a long time. Emperor Manuel Comnenos knows you are coming. He has prepared for you the way a careful ruler prepares for a visitor who might also be an invader. His soldiers are visible, his ships are ready, his spies are everywhere. And yet, when he receives you, he does not act like a man afraid. He welcomes you with ceremony and generosity. There is a banquet, lavish even by royal standards. There are tours of churches and holy sites. Manuel moves beside you as if to say, quietly but firmly, "You are in my house, remember that." For a moment, it almost works. Your court sees marble and gold, incense and chanting, relics and icons, and you can feel the temptation to believe that Christian unity still exists under all this grandeur. But unity is fragile when interests collide. Manuel has his own fears. He has treaties to protect, especially in Anatolia, where the Seljuk Turks wait like a patient blade. He has enemies in the west, particularly the Normans of Sicily, who would love nothing more than to watch Byzantium weakened by a massive foreign army passing through. Above all, Manuel does not want a crusade to become a flood that turns around and crashes into Constantinople. You can sense that fear even beneath his hospitality. And in your own camp, suspicion rose like mold in damp cloth. Your nobles learn that Manuel has made peace with the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. To many of them, that sounds like betrayal. They speak of the Greeks as if they are cousins who smile at you at dinner and count your money when you sleep. The older stories of the First Crusade return to life. Old accusations that Byzantium guides armies into danger, that the emperor is always 2 steps ahead, always ready to sacrifice Westerners to protect his own borders. Some of your advisors go further. They whisper that the true prize isn't Jerusalem at all. They say that if you controlled Constantinople, you would control the road to the Holy Land. They argue that the crusade should begin by taking the empire that sits between you and your goal. It is a dangerous idea. It would turn a holy expedition into a civil war between Christians, and it would set a precedent that could poison everything that comes after. You refuse. Whatever your flaws as a commander, you draw a moral line here. You will not march east under the cross and begin by attacking a Christian capital. You still believe, stubbornly, that the crusade must remain a crusade. Manuel, however, cannot allow your army to linger outside his walls while such talk spreads. He tightens the flow of supplies, applies pressure through officials, and urges you to cross the Bosphorus as soon as possible. He even fuels rumors, claims that the German army ahead of you is already winning victories in Anatolia, as if to push you forward before you have time to reconsider. So you cross. Across the narrow strip of water, the world changes again. The air feels drier, the land feels harsher, the sense of being watched intensifies. And then, at Nicaea, you meet the truth Manuel's rumors tried to hide. Conrad is there. Not the Conrad of imperial pride and massive banners. Not the Conrad that rode out of Germany like a hammer lifted high. This Conrad is surrounded by survivors. Men with hollow faces, knights who have lost horses, soldiers limping on swollen feet, equipment missing, morale broken, discipline torn apart like fabric caught on thorns. They tell you what happened near Dorilé, where the First Crusade once won glory. They tell you how the Seljuks lured the heavy cavalry away from the infantry, how arrows fell in constant waves, how the retreat turned into a collapse of order, how an emperor's army can still dissolve when it marches into the wrong kind of war. For you, Louis, it is like looking into a mirror that shows the future. In that moment, the crusade stops feeling like a heroic pilgrimage and starts feeling like a crisis that could swallow kings. From Nicaea, you and Conrad agree on the next step. You will not repeat the German mistake by marching deep into central Anatolia again. Instead, you will follow the coast, down through Byzantine territory, where in theory supplies and safer routes should exist. In theory. In practice, the march quickly becomes a test of how much an army can endure when the system around it doesn't fully support it. Markets are inconsistent. Local officials hesitate to provide enough food for such a massive host. Where supplies are lacking, parts of your army begin to forage on their own. That foraging leads to clashes. Those clashes feed the belief that the Greeks are hostile, and that belief gives your men moral permission to take what they need by force. You try to keep order, but your army isn't one unified body. It is a coalition of contingents,
each loyal first to its own lords, its own regional leaders, its own internal hierarchy. You are the king, yes, but your authority thins as distance from France grows and hunger rises. You see the pattern clearly. Every day without steady provisions is a day when discipline leaks away. At Ephesus, Conrad's condition worsens. He becomes dangerously ill, exhausted from the earlier disaster and worn down by the march. Manuel offers him a ship back to Constantinople, promising care and safety. Conrad accepts. From a distance, it looks like Manuel is generous. From another angle, it looks like strategy. Remove the German leader from the field, rebuild the Byzantine-German relationship against Sicily, and leave the French to face Anatolia's dangers with fewer allies. Either way, Conrad is taken away over the sea, while you continue over land. And so, Louis, you become the primary commander of what remains of the Crusade's main force. It is a crown made heavier by every mile. As you push onward, rumors multiply. Some say Manuel has purposely withheld support so the Turks can weaken you. Others say Byzantine guides are unreliable, or worse, deliberately misleading. Whether any of it is true almost stops mattering, because mistrust becomes a weapon. It erodes cooperation. It turns every shortage into an accusation. And meanwhile, the enemy doesn't need to win a grand battle to harm you. The enemy only needs to keep moving, keep watching, keep waiting for fatigue to create mistakes. Back in Western Europe, Bernard of Clairvaux cannot see any of this with his own eyes. He is far away, surrounded by parchment and candle smoke, hearing only fragments, letters, rumors, the slow drip of bad news. He had imagined the crusade as a sacred river surging towards the east. Now it is a river breaking into channels, losing strength as it spreads, and he can do nothing but pray that it still reaches the sea. In Constantinople, Manuel has already achieved one of his goals. The Western armies have crossed, and the danger to his capital has passed. In Anatolia, the Seljuks are already achieving theirs. The crusade is walking into a landscape that punishes size, punishes disorder, and rewards speed. And you, Louis, are caught between empires, one Christian, one Muslim, both protecting their own interests, both willing to let you pay the price for your vow. This is the moment the Second Crusade stops being a story about answering the call. It becomes a story about what happens after the call is answered. Because now the question is no longer who will go. The question is, can they survive the road long enough to matter?
Anatolia doesn't fight you like a man. It fights you like a landscape. It drains you in quiet ways first, through heat and cold that change without warning, through long stretches of road where water is never where you expect it, through villages that shut their gates as your column approaches, afraid that feeding you will ruin them, and afraid that refusing you will provoke you. You, Louis of France, keep marching because there is nothing else to do. Stopping is death by hunger. Turning back is death by shame. So you move forward, and every mile feels like the crusade is being tested not by an army, but by the ground beneath your feet. From Nicaea, you chose the coastal route, hoping to stay within Byzantine control, hoping that markets and guidance would make the journey survivable. But the same old problem follows you like a shadow. You don't control the system you depend on. Sometimes provisions appear, sometimes they don't. When they don't, men forage. When men forage, tempers flare. When tempers flare, the thin trust between your army and the local population tears. It's a cycle that repeats until it becomes the background noise of the march. And within your own host, another cycle is forming. Discipline slipping, units separating, leaders arguing, desertions increasing. Your crusade is not one army, it is many armies tied together by one vow. At Ephesus, you see how fragile it all is. Conrad III, already bruised by the disaster near Dorylaeum, falls dangerously ill. He's exhausted,
feverish, barely able to ride. The Crusade's other great crowned leader is suddenly a burden that can't be carried by willpower alone. Then, Emperor Manuel's offer arrives like a lifeboat. A ship back to Constantinople, safe care, recovery in the imperial palace. It looks merciful, it also looks convenient. Conrad accepts, and the German emperor is taken away across the water. The effect on your army is immediate, even if few admit it aloud. You are now the main pillar of the Crusade's leadership. The French host becomes the Crusade's spine, and that means every mistake from here forward will be placed on your shoulders, whether it was truly yours or not. You push on. Winter is still close enough to feel in the wind, but the days are bright and the land grows harsher as you angle inland through the Meander Valley. Turkish riders begin to appear at the edges of sight, never staying long, never close enough for the kind of decisive confrontation your knights understand. They watch, they probe, they test your pace the way wolves test a herd. You respond by tightening your marching order. Knights on the flanks, knights at the front and rear, the vulnerable baggage and the wounded in the center. It's sensible, it's disciplined, at least by the standards of a coalition that has been dragged across half the world, but even a sensible formation can be bled by constant pressure. On the night of Christmas Eve, as you camp outside Ephesus, the Seljuks strike. It's not a grand set-piece battle. It's an attempt to unsettle you, to sap morale, to remind your men that the enemy can reach you even in darkness. You repel them. Your soldiers cheer, relieved to win something, anything, after weeks of anxiety. But you know better than to mistake survival for victory. The Seljuks aren't trying to conquer your camp. They're trying to control your mind. A few days later, on the first day of the new year, the test comes in a more serious form. You reach the Meander River, and Sultan Masoud has prepared a trap. His plan is elegant in its cruelty. Split his force, strike your rear as you approach the water, and block your front from the far bank. The goal isn't to destroy you in one blow. It's to turn the crossing into confusion, to break your formation at the moment you are most vulnerable. The Seljuk Rhine appears on the opposite bank, and arrows begin to fall. Behind you, pressure builds. It is exactly the kind of situation that can dissolve an army into a mob. But this time, your knights find a ford. They push through with controlled aggression, and, most importantly, they close the distance before the Seljuks could slip away cleanly. For once, the enemy's withdrawal is too slow. Your cavalry hits them hard enough to force a real retreat. The mood in your host lifts, not because you think the war is won, but because men who have been walking through fear need proof that their strength still matters. You seize supplies, you take what the enemy left behind. For a brief moment, the crusade feels alive again, and that is the danger. A small victory can give an army the illusion that it has solved the problem, when in truth it has only survived one question to face the next. On January 3rd, you reach Laodicea, and beyond it rises Mount Cadmus, a brutal mass of rock and narrow paths. The landscape becomes a weapon again. The road is steep, the column stretches, the baggage animals slow. The line of march becomes a long, vulnerable spine that can be struck at any weak point. You try to prevent exactly that. You give orders to maintain tight spacing. You rely on your commanders to hold position, to camp where instructed, to keep the army together. And then the mistake happens, the kind that seems small to the person who makes it and catastrophic to everyone who pays for it. The vanguard, led by Geoffrey de Rincon, presses ahead too far. Whether he ignores orders or misunderstands them, the result is the same: separation. The front of the army moves beyond the point where it can support the center. The baggage train, now stretched out along the mountain path, becomes exposed. Sultan Masood sees the opening the way a seasoned hunter sees a gap in the trees. He moves forces onto the heights. He strikes the center of your column not with a single heavy blow, but with fast, relentless pressure that turns narrow road into chaos. Men push, animals panic, carts jam. The slope becomes deadly not because it's steep, but because too many bodies are trying to occupy too little space at the same time. You are in the rear guard when the alarm reaches you. You ride forward with your household knights, but the terrain breaks the power of cavalry. Horses cannot charge up a crowded mountain track. Armor that protects in close combat becomes exhausting weight when you're trying to climb and maneuver. This is where your personal courage becomes undeniable. You fight to hold the line long enough for your people to regroup. You do what a king is supposed to do in the worst moment. You are present. You are visible. You refuse to vanish. Odo of Duil, your chaplain, later describes the moment you nearly get captured, how you climbed a rock face by gripping tree roots, how you held the position with your sword while arrows struck your armor and glanced away, how the enemy, not recognizing who you were, turned away to gather spoils before night closed in. Whether every detail is exact or shaped by the drama of memory, the core truth remains. Mount Cadmus breaks the Crusade's body, and you barely escape with your life. Afterwards, the army is still intact in the broad sense. You have not been destroyed the way Conrad's army was, but you have been wounded in the way that matters most for an expedition. You have lost supplies, lost cohesion, and lost the sense that your march is under control. And when an army begins to feel uncontrolled, fear comes back fast. That is why you turn to the Templars. The Knights of the Temple have a reputation for discipline that ordinary lords envy and resent. Their chain of command is clear. Their training is constant. Their identity is built around obedience. Under the leadership of their Grand Master, Everard de Barres, they reorganize what remains of your march. They divide troops into manageable units. They assign officers who can enforce order. They create structure where noble pride has failed. It works not because the Templars are magical, but because structure matters when everything else is collapsing. When the road itself feels like an enemy, structure becomes the only shield you can hold. The Seljuks continue to track you. They burn what they can. They deny you plunder and forage. They make the land empty, forcing you to rely on whatever supplies you still carry. And you keep moving towards the southern coast, towards the port of Attalia, where you hope ships will carry you to safer ground, towards Cilicia, towards Syria, towards the Holy Land. But as you march, a heavy realization settles in, whether you admit it or not. The crusade is no longer racing towards Jerusalem, it is limping towards survival. And the next decision you make when you reach the sea will reveal what kind of leader you truly are, not in theory, but under the weight of everything you have lost.
When you finally reach Attalia, it doesn't feel like arriving at safety. It feels like stumbling into a decision you can't delay any longer. The port sits on the southern coast of Anatolia, where the air carries salt and the light looks cleaner, as if the sea itself has washed the sky. For weeks, you've marched through a land that seemed determined to break your army apart. You've crossed rivers under pressure, climbed mountains that turned into traps, and watched your supplies shrink until every meal felt like a negotiation with fate. So when you see the harbor, your first instinct is relief. Ships mean escape. Ships mean you can stop feeding a moving city of men on a road that offers nothing back. Ships mean you can reach Cilicia, the Armenian Christian lands, and then Syria, where you believe allies will be waiting, and where the crusade can finally become what it was meant to be. But the moment you step into Attalia, the truth arrives like a cold wave. There aren't enough ships.
A small Byzantine fleet is in the harbor, but it's nowhere near large enough to carry your whole force across the sea. Not your infantry, not the pilgrims, not the servants and attendants who have followed you this far, not the wounded, not the wagons, not the mass of people who made your crusade feel like a nation on the move. Just the king and a portion of the mounted elite. And suddenly, the crusade isn't a march anymore. It's a sorting. Italia is also where you feel, more sharply than ever, the political hand of Byzantium. The local governor demands you renew your oath, loyalty to Emperor Manuel, the same emperor whose support has often been uncertain and whose officials have sometimes treated your host more like a threat than a sacred guest. The demand is humiliating in its timing, even if it's a familiar Byzantine procedure. You agree because what else can you do? But the anger in your camp deepens. Your knights are tired, your infantry is starving, your non-combatants are desperate. And now, with the sea in front of you, you discover you're still trapped. Only this time, the trap isn't a mountain pass, it's arithmetic. Too many people, too few vessels. At first, you insist on the honorable option. You say you will stay with your army. You say you will march onward overland with the rest, even if it takes longer and even if it is dangerous. You try to sound like the king you want to be, the king your men still want to believe in. Then the pressure begins. Your high nobles and senior knights argue that you must go ahead. They insist the crusade needs its king in the Holy Land as soon as possible. They say that if you arrive, you can rally local forces, secure supplies, and rebuild strength, maybe even arrange transport for the rest later. It is a persuasive argument, not because it is noble, but because it is practical, and because it is also convenient for the men making it. In a moment like this, leadership isn't tested by knowing what is right. It is tested by whether you can bear the cost of doing it. Staying with the army would mean sharing the suffering ahead. It would mean risk. It would mean refusing the comfort of the sea when comfort is finally within reach. Leaving would mean safety, speed, and the chance to claim that you are acting for the greater good. You choose to leave. Not because you don't care about those behind you, but because you convince yourself, perhaps honestly, that reaching the Holy Land quickly is the best way to save the crusade. Yet the moment your foot touches the deck, you feel the weight of what you've done. A king is not supposed to separate himself from his army, not in a world where loyalty depends on presence, and where the sight of the ruler standing in the same dust as his men is the simplest kind of legitimacy. As the ships pull away from Italia, the shoreline recedes, and with it, a part of your vow recedes too. Behind you, the abandoned majority must decide what to do. Some remain in Italia, unable or unwilling to march again. Some take service with the local Byzantine garrison, trading crusade for survival. Chronicles even suggest that a few enter the service of the Sultan, not necessarily because they have changed faith, but because hunger can push a man into choices he never imagined making. Those who attempt the overland route face the same enemy as before, the land, and the riders who live inside it. Many will not reach Syria, and those who do arrive will arrive as shadows of the force that once left France with such confidence. You cross the sea in only a few days, 3 days, give or take, depending on wind and currents. It is almost obscene how quickly water can erase the suffering of land travel. The deck is steady, the horizon is clean, food is limited but present. The fear of ambush fades into the sound of waves striking timber. In that narrow space between Anatolia and Syria, you have time to think, not like a general, but like a man. You think of the road behind you, the Meander River, Mount Cadmus, the nights when arrows came out of darkness, the moments when your armor felt less like protection and more like a prison of metal. You think of the faces of the people who followed you, some because they believed in God's mercy, some because they believed in your crown. And you wonder how a crusade that began with such purity of purpose has already been forced into so many compromises. Then, on the 19th of March in 1148, you arrive near the port of St. Simeon and enter the Principality of Antioch. Antioch is a shock to the senses after Anatolia. It's a city of wealth and color, where trade routes meet and cultures overlap. Its court is not the austere world of northern France. It's Mediterranean, vibrant, and steeped in the manners of the south. Music, poetry, feasts, polished speech, and confident display. Its ruler, Raymond of Poitiers, receives you like a man greeting an answer to prayer. He's charismatic, charming, and hungry for advantage. Antioch sits on a dangerous frontier. Raymond knows he cannot afford to waste the presence of the King of France. He also knows how to make you feel welcome. For you, Louis, the hospitality is both comfort and temptation. It's easy to forget your exhaustion in a hall filled with warm light and friendly voices. It's easy to let your shoulders relax for the first time in months. For Eleanor, it's something deeper. Antioch feels like home in a way France has not, because Raymond is her uncle, and his court resembles the culture of Aquitaine. Eleanor thrives here. She smiles. She speaks easily. She listens to music that reminds her of the world she came from. Later, enemies will spread stories about her time in Antioch, because history often punishes women who become politically inconvenient. But the more believable truth is simpler. Eleanor is alive again in a place that fits her. And that aliveness throws your own difference into sharper relief. Raymond wants one thing from you: a campaign against Aleppo. He argues that the moment is perfect. Zengi is dead. His domains are divided. Nur al-Din holds Aleppo, his brother holds Mosul, and their rivalry creates a rare opening. If you strike now, you could cripple the Zengid power that threatens the Crusader states. You could change the balance in the north permanently. Strategically, it is a real argument. Aleppo matters. But you are not only a strategist, you are a king who has lost much of his infantry, much of his baggage train, and much of the cohesion that would be needed for a serious siege. Even if you agree with Raymond, you do not have the kind of force that can easily reduce a major city deep in enemy territory. And you know something else. More crusaders are arriving by sea farther south in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, at ports like Acre and Tyre. If you want to rebuild your army into something capable, you need to go where the troops are gathering. You need to rejoin the center of crusading power in the Levant. You also want Jerusalem itself. You might not say it out loud, but your vow was never only about winning battles. It was about reaching the holy places, kneeling at the sites you have imagined since childhood, and completing the pilgrimage that defines the whole undertaking. So you make your decision. You will leave Antioch and go south. That's when the fragile peace in your marriage splits open. Eleanor supports Raymond. She sees Antioch's needs. She sees the logic of striking Aleppo. And she sees, perhaps, that staying here would keep her within a world she understands and enjoys. When you insist on departing, she threatens something unthinkable. She speaks of annulment. In the Middle Ages, such a threat is not only personal, it's political. It's a challenge to your authority, and it risks turning your royal marriage into a public crisis. You respond the way a king who feels cornered responds. You refuse. You tighten control. You make it clear the decision is yours, and you remove Eleanor from the center of the debate. Then you leave Antioch. Not with a grand victory, not with a new frontier gained, but with a sense that something essential has been damaged, between you and your queen, between you and your men, and perhaps even between you and the crusade itself. As your party rides south towards Jerusalem, the path is smoother than Anatolia, but the weight on your shoulders is heavier. Because now the crusade is no longer just a war against distant enemies. It's also a struggle against time, against politics, against fractured alliances, and against the choices you've made to keep moving forward. And in the distance, beyond the hills, the holy city waits, silent, luminous, and indifferent to the price you paid just to reach it.
By the time you reach the heart of the Latin East, the Second Crusade no longer feels like a single army on a single mission. It feels like something patched together out of exhaustion, pride, prayer, and stubborn momentum. Conrad arrives first. You can see it in the way he carries himself now. He is still the German king, still surrounded by titles and expectations, but the road has taken something from him. Anatolia has a way of stripping away the parts of leadership that are purely ceremonial. After Dorylaeum, after the retreat, after illness and humiliation, Conrad steps onto Levantine soil with a hard kind of clarity. He has learned what a continent-wide vow cannot teach by itself, that courage is not a plan and numbers are not protection. He is quieter, less eager to prove, more alert to the cost of every decision. In time, people will say the Second Crusade taught a generation of rulers how not to march to the east, and if that is true, Conrad is one of the first students, forced to learn by pain. Then you arrive, Louis. When you finally enter Jerusalem, it is not like marching into a captured city. It is like arriving at a place you have carried inside your head since childhood. The walls, the streets, the stones, everything is smaller than the myth and heavier than the dream. You are a king, but at that moment you are also something else, a pilgrim who has survived long enough to kneel. You dismount, you walk, you pray. For a brief time, the politics, the arguments, the hunger, the bitterness of Byzantium and Anatolia, those things feel far away, like a storm you have crossed. You touch the holy places with hands that still remember the weight of armor, and you tell yourself that the suffering meant something, that it has been recorded somewhere beyond human memory. But Jerusalem does not run on tears. The holy city is sacred, yes, but the kingdom that surrounds it survives through hard measures. Garrisons, forts, patrols, harvests, coins, treaties, and constant calculation. The Latin East is not a shrine suspended in heaven. It is a frontier state, and frontiers do not forgive mistakes. You can sense that immediately, because beneath the welcome there is also expectation. The locals have waited for months for the kings of the West to arrive with overwhelming strength. What they see instead is a force that has been reduced by desertion, sickness, and the road itself. And yet more crusaders keep arriving. Ships land at ports like Acre and Tyre, knights from Provence, men who fought in Iberia and sailed onward, contingents hired as mercenaries, adventurers seeking purpose, veterans seeking redemption. Added to the local forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the total gathering is still impressive, possibly the largest Christian host to assemble here since the First Crusade. But it is also fragile. Because it is not one body, it is many bodies stitched together. Different languages, different priorities, different loyalties. The nobles of Jerusalem think first about the survival of their kingdom. Conrad's men think about restoring German honor after Anatolia. Your French nobles think about what they have already lost, and whether any victory can justify it. And in the background there is the constant hum of rivalries, personal and political, like cracks in a wall you can only see up close. Far away in Europe, Bernard of Clairvaux is living through a different kind of war. He cannot see Jerusalem's streets. He cannot see the faces of the tired men who finally arrived. All he receives are letters, rumors, and the shifting tone of the continent he helped mobilize. He had preached that this moment was a gift, a rare season of mercy. Now he can feel how quickly mercy becomes accusation when outcomes do not match expectations. In modern terms, Bernard is facing the cost of mass persuasion. When you raise a civilization to its feet with sacred language, you are also creating an invisible contract. People will accept suffering, but they will demand meaning. And meaning, in their eyes, often looks like victory. Bernard still believes in the cause. He still believes the crusade is holy, but he is beginning to understand something he cannot fix with another sermon. Once an idea becomes a movement, it takes on a life of its own. Back in Jerusalem, the movement needs a target. Edessa, the original reason the crusade was called, is no longer a realistic objective. After Zengi's death, Edessa briefly flickered back into Frankish hands, but Nur al-Din moved fast. The city was devastated. Whatever hope the West had of simply marching in and restoring the county of Edessa is gone. The crusade has arrived too late for the mission it was summoned to fulfill. That is one of the most brutal ironies of the entire expedition. So now the leaders must choose a new purpose, not just for strategy, but for morale. An army can endure hardship if it believes the end is clear. It collapses when the end becomes an argument. You meet with Conrad, with Baldwin III, with Queen Melisende, with the leading lords of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and with the military orders who understand frontier warfare better than most men who sailed from the West. There are options, and each one is a gamble. Some think about the northern front and the Zangid lands around Aleppo. Others think about tightening the southern border. Some argue for a target that is symbolically powerful, the kind of victim of victory proclaimed from pulpits across Europe. And slowly, the idea that rises above the others is Damascus. To outsiders, it sounds shocking. Damascus had once been an ally of Jerusalem against Zengi. It had once been part of a delicate balance that kept the region from falling under one dominant power. But that balance has changed. Damascus has drifted closer to Nur al-Din. Alliances have shifted. Marriages have been arranged. The politics of the region are moving towards consolidation, and Jerusalem's leaders fear what will happen if Damascus is fully absorbed into Zengi hands. If Damascus falls to the Franks, it would strengthen Jerusalem's frontier, create a deeper buffer, and potentially split Muslim power between Syria and Egypt.
It is not madness as a strategic concept, it is bold, and that boldness is part of its appeal. There is also another temptation, quieter but powerful, the belief that Damascus might not resist for long, that internal divisions in the city could make it vulnerable, that a sudden show of force, kings of France and Germany together, the true cross carried before the host, might compel a quick surrender. In other words, Damascus looks like the kind of target that could reward a coalition desperate for a clear win. You can feel the weight of that desperation. Conrad wants redemption for Germany's losses in Anatolia. You want to prove that the suffering of your march meant something, that the cross you took at Veilai was not just a beautiful vow with an ugly ending. The Kingdom of Jerusalem wants to protect itself before Nur al-Din becomes unstoppable, and everyone wants a victory large enough to silence doubt. But deep inside, you also sense the danger of choosing a target because it feels like the solution to your morale. Because morale is not stone, and it cannot hold a siege. The crusade is standing at the edge of a decision that will define it. If the coalition chooses well and moves quickly, it may reshape the politics of the Levant. If it chooses poorly, the entire expedition may unravel, not in one dramatic collapse, but in the slow death of trust. By late June, the discussions sharpen. The leaders prepare to commit, and in the distance beyond the hills and the orchards, Damascus waits, famous, wealthy, ringed by gardens and water, protected not only by walls, but by the speed with which it can call others to its defense. In the next movement of this story, the crusade will stop being a march and become a siege, and the question will no longer be whether kings can reach the Holy Land. The question will be whether they can do anything once they arrive.
Acre smells like salt, tar, and money. It is the kind of city that never truly sleeps, because the sea keeps delivering new people, new rumors, and new deals. Ships unload timber, grain, cloth, weapons, horses, and men who swear they came for God, while quietly asking what the campaign might pay. In the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Acre is not simply a port, it is a lifeline. If Jerusalem is the heart, then Acre is the mouth and the stomach, swallowing supplies and sending strength inland. You, Louis of France, arrive here carrying more than a crown. You carry the fatigue of Anatolia, the fracture of your marriage, and the pressure of expectations. You are surrounded by nobles who want a clear goal, and by locals who have waited months for Western kings to arrive with unstoppable power. Conrad stands beside you, and his presence changes the atmosphere even when he says nothing. He is still a ruler of immense status, but everyone can feel that he is a man marked by the road. He needs a victory that can be spoken aloud without apology. He needs a moment that will silence the memory of Dory Lamb, at least in the minds of men who measure rulers by results. Then there is Baldwin III, young and proud, already learning what it means to rule a frontier kingdom. And beside him, Queen Melisende, shrewd and experienced, watching the two great Western monarchs with the patience of someone who has survived long enough to know that allies can be as dangerous as enemies. All of you gather because a coalition this large cannot exist without a purpose. Without a target, it begins to rot from the inside. In the late spring and early summer of 1148, the leaders meet and talk becomes argument. Each region brings its own logic, each lord brings his own fear, and each king brings his own need for meaning. There are three main doors in front of you. One leads north toward Aleppo. Antioch favors that path. They argue it is the true strategic key, because Aleppo is the backbone of Zengid power in Syria. Zengi is dead, but his legacy is not. His son Nur al-Din is rising, and the north feels the pressure first. If you hit Aleppo, some say, you might break the enemy's strength before it consolidates. The problem is that Aleppo is far. It is deep. It demands a long campaign, heavy siege equipment, stable supply lines, and a level of coordination this coalition may not be able to maintain. After Anatolia, nobody wants to gamble on a long march into hostile territory unless the reward is absolutely certain. Another door leads south, toward Ascalon. This is a target the Kingdom of Jerusalem understands well. Ascalon is a coastal stronghold that threatens the southern frontier. Taking it would protect the kingdom, strengthen trade, and remove a constant danger. But Ascalon is not glamorous to men who crossed oceans and mountains. It is not the kind of prize that makes Europe gasp. For the kings of France and Germany, and for many of the nobles who came seeking a world-changing victory, Ascalon feels too small, too slow, too local. Then there is the third door. Damascus. The name alone carries weight. It is famous, wealthy, ancient, a city of gardens and water sitting like a jewel at the edge of the desert. It is close enough to strike quickly, and important enough to matter. Strategically, Damascus is not a foolish choice. If the Franks could take it, Jerusalem's frontier would deepen. It could create a barrier against Nur al-Din and his ambitions, and it might even sever the connection between Muslim Syria and Muslim Egypt. In the minds of many Crusader leaders, Damascus looks like a move that could reshape the region in one blow. And there is another temptation, quieter but powerful, the belief that Damascus might not hold. For years, Damascus had sometimes cooperated with Jerusalem against bigger threats. Alliances in the Levant were never purely religious, they were pragmatic. They shifted with the winds of power.
Even now, some believe that factions inside Damascus were uneasy about Nur al-Din. They whispered that if the Crusaders appeared suddenly with overwhelming force, the city might surrender quickly, perhaps even through negotiation. In other words, Damascus looked like the kind of target that could deliver a fast, spectacular success, a victory that would justify all the suffering of the march, all the expenses of mobilization, all the vows spoken in fields and cathedrals back in Europe. From a modern perspective, this is the moment where coalitions often make their most dangerous decisions. When too many people need a win and need it quickly, the temptation is to choose the target that seems both meaningful and easy. A city that is close, famous, and plausibly vulnerable becomes irresistible. That is exactly what Damascus appears to be. So the decision settles, not in one instant, but in the slow agreement of tired men who want the war to finally begin on terms they understand. Damascus will be the objective. Far away, Bernard of Clairvaux cannot see the council table in Acre. He cannot hear the tone of voice when nobles disagree, or the silence when a king realizes his choices are narrowing. But he senses the weight of it anyway, because he is tied to this crusade by something deeper than politics. He is tied by responsibility. He had preached a sacred moment. He had called men to leave their homes. He had helped push kings onto the road. Now, as the crusade shifts from its original goal, Edessa, toward a new and riskier prize, Bernard's fire is about to meet the hardest test of all, whether belief can survive disappointment. For you, Louis, the choice of Damascus carries a personal meaning too. Edessa is gone. It cannot be recovered the way people once imagined. Aleppo is too far for the force you truly have. Ascalon is not enough to satisfy Europe's hunger for significance. Damascus feels like the one place where everything could still be saved. Conrad sees it similarly. He wants a victory that can be proclaimed in Germany, a victory that makes men forget the long retreat and remember only the moment the emperor stood before a great city and made history. The leaders of Jerusalem want it because they fear the future. They fear Nur al-Din, and they fear what will happen if Damascus becomes fully part of his power. They see the siege as a chance to strike before the door closes forever. Once Damascus is chosen, the machinery begins to move. The host gathers at Tiberias in mid-July. They bring with them the most sacred standard of the kingdom, the relic of the true cross. Whether a modern observer believes in its holding is not the point. In that society, the relic is morale made physical. It is the proof that God has not abandoned them. It is the banner that turns an army into a story. From Tiberias, the Crusader host marches toward Damascus. The approach is deliberate. They come from the west, through the green orchards watered by the Barada River. The orchards are thick, fertile, and defensible. They are also a source of food and water for the besiegers. It seems like the best place to set up and strike. To your men, the gardens of Damascus look almost unreal after the barren hardship of Anatolia. You can smell fruit and fresh water. You can hear birds. For some, it feels like the land itself is promising that this time will be different. But you know better now. You have seen how quickly a beautiful landscape can become a weapon. As the army reaches the orchards, Damascus defenders attempt to resist there, using the gardens as a barrier. The Crusaders push them back and secure access to the river. It is an encouraging start. It feels like momentum. It feels like the first chapter of a victory Europe has been waiting for. And that is where the Council's gamble becomes real. Because the Crusaders have not come prepared for a long siege. They have come expecting a quick decision, a surrender, a breakthrough, a sudden collapse from within. They are betting that Damascus will fall before its friends can arrive. The next phase will decide whether that bet was brilliance or a fatal illusion.
Damascus doesn't announce itself like a fortress. It feels like an oasis that decided to become a capital. From a distance, you don't see bare walls rising from rock. You see green first, thick orchards and gardens spreading outward, fed by the Barada River. From Anatolia's hard roads and empty hills, the sight is almost disorienting. Water glints between trees. The air smells alive. For many in the Crusader host, it's the first time in months that the world looks generous again. But you've learned what the road can teach a king very quickly. Beauty can still be dangerous. In late July of 1148, the coalition arrives. You, Louis of France, ride with Conrad of Germany and Baldwin of Jerusalem. Around you are lords of the Latin East, knights who crossed from Europe, and men who have already paid for this crusade with hunger and exhaustion. The relic of the true cross is carried as a standard, not because it guarantees victory, but because it holds the army's mind together. It's a reminder that the suffering was supposed to lead somewhere. The approach is from the west, through the orchards. It's the most logical direction. The gardens provide cover, but they also provide food, wood, and, most importantly, water. A besieging army that controls water controls time. The defenders of Damascus understand that too. They meet you among the trees, trying to hold the orchards like a living wall. There are skirmishes in narrow paths and irrigation channels, a kind of fighting that doesn't match the heroic pictures painted in European sermons. It's confusing, close, interrupted by branches and fences and the sudden appearance of men at an angle you didn't expect. But the Crusaders push through. The coalition manages to secure the river line and the mood lifts. For the first time since leaving Europe, the campaign feels like it's finally doing what it came to do, applying pressure to a target that matters. And for a brief moment, you can almost believe the plan might work. Inside the city, Mu'in ad-Din Onur, Damascus's ruler, moves quickly. Onur is not the type of leader who waits for fate.
He doesn't treat the siege as a moral drama. He treats it as a problem of hours, supplies, and reinforcements. He strengthens the walls, organizes patrols, calls up local forces from surrounding districts, and positions scouts to watch every road. He also does something even more important. He sends messages for help. The Crusader coalition has come expecting a rapid outcome, a surrender, a breakthrough, perhaps even internal betrayal that opens a gate. But Honor's plan is to deny them speed, to stretch the siege long enough that bigger powers can respond. Because Damascus is not lone. Honor reaches out to the Zengids, Nur al-Din in Aleppo, and his brother in Mosul. Those two men have their own rivalry, their own ambitions, their own fragile relationship. But the threat to Damascus is too large to ignore. If Damascus falls to the Franks, the political map of the region changes overnight. So Honor forces a choice upon them: come or watch Syria split apart. From a modern perspective, this is the kind of leadership move that wins wars without winning battles. Honor understands that he doesn't need to defeat the Crusaders head-on. He needs to make their timeline collapse. He needs to turn their quick strike into a slow trap. In siege warfare, time is often more lethal than swords. Back outside the walls, the Crusaders keep pressing. The first 2 days are full of effort and expectation. Conrad's presence is especially sharp here. After the humiliation of Anatolia, he seems driven to prove that he can still stand at the center of an historic moment. He fights hard, leads aggressively, and for a while that shared urgency gives the coalition a kind of unity it has often lacked. But Damascus does not break. And then the news begins to seep into your camp like cold water through cloth. Relief armies are moving. At first it's a rumor. Then it becomes a certainty. You hear that Nur al-Din is approaching. You hear that forces from Mosul are also on the road. You hear it from scouts, you hear it from prisoners, you hear it in the growing confidence of Damascus's defenders, who now fight as if they know the city doesn't have to fall quickly, because time is bringing help. This is the moment where a siege either becomes serious or becomes impossible. A serious siege requires preparation for the long haul: stable supply lines, secure access to water, clear command structure, and a plan for what happens when an enemy army arrives to challenge you in the open. But your coalition came believing Damascus would fall fast. In that belief is the seed of the disaster. As the days pass, arguments intensify inside the Crusader leadership. Some suggest shifting positions to look for weaker points. Others insist on staying where the water is. Some want to press harder immediately before reinforcements arrive. Others begin quietly calculating the cost of staying one more day. This is where later chroniclers disagree about details. William of Tyre, writing years afterwards, tells a story in which the Crusaders moved their camp to the eastern side of Damascus, chasing weaker walls, only to discover that the ground there was worse, the water scarce, and the defenders were worse than expected. But Ibn al-Qalanisi, a Damascus chronicler who lived through the siege, describes the action without emphasizing a dramatic full relocation. His account suggests a more chaotic reality: pressure, counter-pressure, and then withdrawal as the situation became untenable. You don't need to choose one version to understand the truth underneath both. Whether the camp shifted fully or only partially, the coalition was losing what it needed most: clarity. And clarity is everything when you are standing in front of a city that can survive longer than you can. By the fourth day, the atmosphere has changed completely. The defenders are firmer, the rumors of relief armies are no longer rumors, and the coalition's internal fractures begin to show. Each group has its own risk tolerance, its own priorities. The lords of Jerusalem are thinking about survival. They cannot afford to lose their kingdom's core force in a gamble outside Damascus. Conrad's men want a chance of redemption, but they are already haunted by the memory of being overwhelmed in Anatolia. They can feel the same danger forming again, being caught far from safety with an enemy who moves faster than you can. Your French nobles, Louis, are exhausted. Many of them already believe they have paid enough. They did not come to die outside Damascus after months of marching, only to return home with nothing but stories of failure. And you, the king, are trapped between all of them. The most brutal part of leadership is that sometimes you can see the correct move, but the coalition around you will not hold long enough to execute it. A king can order courage. He cannot order unity. By dawn on the 28th of July, the decision is made. You withdraw. Not in panic and not in disgraceful disorder, but with the heavy discipline of men who know they are stepping away from the one moment they promised Europe they would seize. You ride back toward Jerusalem, and Damascus remains standing, its gardens still green, its walls still intact, its defenders now certain that even crowned kings can be turned back if the city holds long enough. From a modern perspective, the failure is not mysterious. The coalition misjudged time. It gambled on speed without guaranteeing the conditions that speed possible. It relied on uncertain assumptions about internal division. It did not arrive with a unified command structure strong enough to keep competing interests aligned once the siege stopped being easy. And Damascus's leadership did exactly what good defenders do. They delayed, organized, and summoned the wider region before the attackers could force a conclusion. 4 days. That's what makes this moment so hard to swallow. Because 4 days sounds like nothing. It sounds like a brief storm. But those 4 days carried the weight of years of preaching, months of marching, and the hopes of a continent. And when you turn your horse away from Damascus, you can feel something break that is harder to read to Rabbi. It is the belief that this crusade is still moving toward a clear, inevitable triumph. Now it is moving toward an ending no one wants to name yet.
When the Crusader army returns from Damascus, Jerusalem feels smaller. The city is still sacred, the churches still crowded with prayer, the relics still gleaming in candlelight. But the atmosphere has changed. A coalition that marched out with crowned kings and the confidence of a continent has come back with no great prize to show, and no new purpose strong enough to replace the one that just failed. In the days after the withdrawal, the leaders meet again. There are discussions, sharper and more cautious than before. Some voices suggest shifting the Crusade's energy toward Ascalon, the stronghold on the southern coast that has long threatened the kingdom's border. On paper, it makes sense. It is a practical objective, and it would strengthen Jerusalem's security. But paper does not carry fatigue. After Damascus, few are willing to take another risk. The coalition that had held together by sheer momentum is unraveling, not in one loud argument, but in the quiet way a rope frays when it has been stretched too far. Men begin to look at each other differently. Suspicion replaces enthusiasm. Everyone has a private explanation for why it failed. Some blame the locals, some blame the Europeans, some blame the kings, some blame the military orders. And beneath those accusations is a darker thought, spoken rarely but felt everywhere. Maybe God did not intend this crusade to succeed. For Conrad, the moment is decisive. You, Conrad III, have already lost too much in Anatolia. Your army shattered before it reached the Holy Land. Your reputation, so carefully built, was scarred by a defeat that could not be disguised as a minor setback. Damascus was supposed to be the moment that turned the story around. Instead, it became a second disappointment. So when the crusade offers no clear next step, you do what a practical ruler does when the campaign has reached its limit. You leave. In early September of 1148, you sail away from the Kingdom of Jerusalem. You return to Constantinople, where Emperor Manuel receives you warmly, almost as if the Crusade's failure has made you easier to manage. You and Manuel speak as rulers do, about alliances, about Sicily, about mutual enemies. Politics, which had been suspended under the language of holiness, rises again like a tide returning to shore. From a modern point of view, Conrad's departure is a kind of controlled retreat. Staying longer would not produce victory, it would only increase the cost. A king must know when to stop bleeding. But leaving also carries a message everyone understands. The crusade, as a united enterprise, is breaking apart. Louis, you remain. You stayed in Palestine through the winter and into the next year, until Easter of 1149. Some of it is devotion. You still want to do good for the Holy Land, to make the journey mean something beyond failure. Some of it is pride. Returning to France too quickly would make the story feel like an unfinished sentence, and your enemies at home would not hesitate to turn it against you. And some of it is personal. Eleanor. The tension between you and your queen, already stretched to the edge in Antioch, has not healed. If anything, the failure at Damascus and the exhaustion of the campaign have made it worse. Eleanor is determined to end the marriage when she can. She has powerful reasons. She carries the pride of Aquitaine, and she knows her political value. She also knows that her union with you has become a cage. You, Louis, cannot bear the thought of losing her, not just as a wife, but as an emblem of your kingship, and as the bridge to Aquitaine's vast power. So you keep her close. You delay. You hope that time, prayer, and distance from Antioch will soften her resolve. But the crusade has changed both of you. It has burned away the illusions that once made your differences tolerable. What remains is a relationship held together by authority on one side and resistance on the other. Even the land itself seems to press the truth toward the surface. You can keep a queen under guard, but you cannot keep a heart obedient. While you linger in the Holy Land, the wider situation grows worse. In the north, Antioch pays the price for the opportunity that slipped away. Raymond of Poitiers, the charismatic prince who had welcomed you, Louis, and urged a campaign against Aleppo, falls in battle in 1149 at Inab against Nur al-Din. It is not only the death of a man, it is a strategic shock. Antioch is weakened, and Nur al-Din's reputation rises. For those who remember Antioch in the spring of 1148, Raymond's death feels like history collecting a debt. People begin asking the question that always haunts failed campaigns. What if? What if Louis had stayed and fought in the north? What if Aleppo had been targeted instead of Damascus? What if the Zengids had been struck while they were still divided? There is no answer, only the ache of alternate futures. And now the Crusade's failure in the east begins to reshape relationships far beyond Syria.
The mistrust between Latin Crusaders and Byzantine deepens. Louis, you return home by sea, and even that journey carries tension. There are moments when Byzantine forces pressure ships and remind you that Manuel's empire does not forget what it fears. You, who once refused to consider attacking Constantinople, come back with bitterness that makes the idea seem less unthinkable than it once did. In Italy, you begin to see King Roger of Sicily differently. The man whose offer you rejected at the start, because you feared his ambitions, now appears as a potential counterweight to Byzantine. In the long shadow of this crusade, the political map of Europe shifts subtly, not with a single treaty, but with a change in trust. Back in Jerusalem, after Conrad's departure and your own eventual decision to leave, the crusade is effectively over, not because anyone declares it finished, but because the energy that held it together is gone. That is often how great enterprises end, not in a final battle, but in a slow unraveling, each group turning toward home, each leader calculating what can still be saved, each vow becoming a private burden rather than a shared mission. And yet, even in failure, the Second Crusade leaves behind something that cannot be erased. It leaves behind memory. For those who marched across Anatolia, the experience becomes a warning carried for the rest of their lives. For many, it cools enthusiasm for future expeditions to the Holy Land. People will still speak of crusading, still preach it, still raise funds, but the certainty that God will simply grant victory to a holy army has been damaged. Louis, you will return to France admired in some circles, simply because you went, because in a culture where crusading is a moral ideal, the act of enduring can be praised even without triumph. But admiration does not heal the deepest wound. Your marriage will not recover, your confidence will never be as simple as it was before you left Vézelay. Conrad, you will carry the lesson back to Germany, and it will echo into the next generation. It will shape how future rulers plan, supply, and discipline their armies. It will harden their view of Byzantine. It will teach them that the East is not a stage for glory. It is a world that punishes the unprepared. And in the Holy Land itself, the Crusader states will keep living, because frontiers cannot afford despair. They will build castles, they will negotiate, they will fight smaller wars and win smaller victories. They will adapt, because adaptation is what survival looks like when miracles do not arrive. But the dream that drove the Second Crusade, the dream of a swift, continent-backed rescue, has ended. And everyone who took part knows it, even if no one wants to say it aloud.
By the time the last banners of the Second Crusade begin to drift back toward Europe, the war is no longer happening only on roads and in siege lines. It is happening in memory. It is happening in the quiet moments when men wake at night and remember Anatolia's emptiness, or the green orchards of Damascus that looked so close to victory until they didn't. It is happening in the way letters are written, in the way sermons are received, in the way a promise can feel holy in spring and unbearable by winter. And no one feels that shift more sharply than Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard is not in the Holy Land. He does not see the dust on Louis's cloak or the hollow faces of Conrad's survivors. He does not hear the arguments in the Crusader councils or the soft panic that spreads when food runs low. What he receives is something colder: reports, rumors, and the slow, unmistakable tone of disappointment rising across Christendom. People had listened to Bernard as if he were speaking for heaven. They had taken vows because he told them the moment was rare, blessed, almost like a sacred season of mercy. They had believed that if they moved together, if kings and knights and pilgrims marched under one cross, God would do what he had done for the first Crusaders, open the road and grant victory. Then Damascus failed. And when a movement built on meaning fails to deliver meaning, the questions turn sharp. Did Bernard promise too much? Did he ignite a fire that burned the wrong hands? Was the crusade itself flawed, or were the people unworthy? Bernard answers the way a man of faith answers. He writes, he preaches. He insists the cause was holy and that failure must be understood through the lens of human weakness and divine mystery. In his work, De Consideratione, he defends the crusading project and points to sin as the true enemy, the hidden rot that can ruin even a sacred enterprise. To a modern listener, it may sound like evasion, but to understand Bernard, you have to understand what he is truly facing. He is facing the cost of persuasion. When you move a civilization with words, you are not just shaping emotions, you are creating expectations. You are building an invisible contract between the preacher and the people. And when reality breaks that contract, the preacher becomes the nearest target for grief. Bernard does not lose his reputation for holiness in a simple way. He remains a revered figure, but something in the atmosphere changes. The crusade has shown that a saint's voice cannot replace a general's plan, that purity of intention does not automatically solve the practical problems of distance, supply, terrain, and divided leadership. In that sense, Bernard becomes a symbol of the age's great tension, the gap between a sacred ideal and the systems needed to achieve it. Louis and Conrad carry different versions of the same lesson. Louis returns to the West with his dignity partly intact, because in a society where crusading has become an ideal, the act of going still matters. He can be praised for suffering and persistence even without triumph. He will be remembered as a king who did not hide behind comfort. But Louis also returns changed. The crusade does not make him more confident.
It makes him more serious, more wary, and more vulnerable to bitterness. It also deepens the fractures in his personal life. His relationship with Eleanor does not recover. The crusade did not simply fail to win a city, it failed to hold together the most important partnership in his kingdom. Conrad returns as a different kind of ruler as well. He comes back hardened by defeat and by the knowledge that an army can dissolve long before it reaches its objective. In his case, the crusade becomes a warning written into imperial memory, and that warning will echo into the next generation, shaping how later rulers approach the East. Years later, when Frederick Barbarossa leads an army across Anatolia during the Third Crusade, he will march with far stricter discipline, stronger organization, and a more independent supply system. Those choices will not come from chance. They will come from lessons learned in the shadow of Conrad's failures. In this way, even a failed crusade can teach. And the Second Crusade, despite its heartbreak in the Levant, is not a single story of defeat. It is a story with multiple fronts and multiple outcomes. In Iberia, under the same umbrella of crusading privilege, Christian forces made dramatic gains. Lisbon fell to a coalition that combined Portuguese leadership with Northern European crusaders. Almeria fell through the cooperation of Iberian power and maritime strength, with Italian cities seeking both spiritual merit and commercial advantage. Further campaigns followed, and the balance of power on the peninsula shifted. In the Baltic frontier, the Wendish Crusade produced limited immediate results, but it set a precedent that would shape centuries. It extended crusading ideology into Northern and Eastern Europe, linking spiritual aims to territorial expansion. What began as a summer campaign would become a long chapter in medieval history, one that pulled pagan societies into the orbit of Latin Christendom over time, not always by persuasion, and not always by the ideals Bernard once preached. So when we ask what the Second Crusade meant, the honest answer is complicated. The central goal, strengthening the Latin East, was not achieved in the way Europe hoped. Edessa was not recovered, Damascus did not fall, and the expedition damaged trust between Western Crusaders and Byzantium, deepening the suspicion that would poison future relations. Yet the crusade also demonstrated something powerful, the ability of Latin Christendom to mobilize across borders, across languages, across political rivalries, and to act as a shared civilization under one spiritual banner. From a modern perspective, that may be the true significance of the Second Crusade. It shows a Europe growing more interconnected, more capable of large-scale coordination, more willing to place itself under a single narrative strong enough to override local interests, at least temporarily. It also shows the limits of that narrative. Because in the end, the crusade does not fail because its people are less brave than their fathers. It fails because a massive coalition without unified command, without consistent supply, and without complete control of its route cannot reliably force outcomes in a distant, contested land. Faith can motivate a march, but it cannot build roads, fill granaries, or stop political rivalries from reappearing when pressure rises. And that truth changes crusading culture going forward. Future crusaders will still pray, still seek indulgence, still speak of holy purpose. But the most effective leaders will also become meticulous organizers. They will draft strict codes of discipline, they will negotiate shipping contracts, they will create supply bases, they will reduce their dependence on unreliable allies. They will treat the journey itself as a battlefield. In other words, the crusade will become more professional, because the Second Crusade proved what happens when it isn't. And the Latin East, surprisingly, does not collapse immediately after this failure. The Crusader states adapt, they fortify, they negotiate, they fight smaller wars, they attract funding from the West, they continue to build military orders into powerful institutions. Jerusalem itself will even expand in later years, capturing Ascalon in the early 1150s. For a time, the Latin East will flourish again. But the larger shift has already taken place. The Second Crusade leaves behind an aftertaste that will linger for a generation, a sense that the road to the Holy Land is not a straightforward